Tonight I'll show you the fastest way to turn zero into power. Not hustle, not motivation, but entering the state that money is forced to echo. Most people hear the number zero and feel a tightening in the chest before they ever think a complete thought. The mind rushes ahead to images of collapse, punishment, humiliation, or failure, as if the number itself carries a moral verdict. Zero becomes the symbol of being cut off, of having done something wrong, of having reached the end of the road. And yet this reaction is learned. It is not inherent to the number. It is a conditioned emotional reflex, built from years of stories, comparisons, and inherited fears about what money is supposed to mean and what it says about who you are. From the standpoint taught by Neville Goddard, this fear is not just unnecessary, it is misplaced. Power does not begin with the amount in your account. It begins with the state you occupy while looking at it. Two people can stand before the same number, see the same zero, and experience entirely different realities. One experiences panic and contraction, while the other experiences clarity and stillness. The difference is not financial, it is psychological. It is the state of consciousness through which the number is interpreted. Seen correctly, the zero state is not a verdict, but a reset. It is a clean inner ledger, no momentum pulling from the past. No identity built from debt, hustle, compensation, or proving. No story insisting that tomorrow must look like yesterday. In this state, there is nothing to defend, nothing to justify, nothing to explain. The mind is no longer negotiating with an old narrative. It is quiet enough to listen, and that quiet is not emptiness by default. It is potential. Neville often spoke of creation arising from the void, not as nothingness, but as the fertile silence before form appears. Before anything is named, measured, or counted, there is awareness itself. There is the simple sense of I am, not I am broke, not I am behind, not I am catching up, but I am, prior to definition. This is where creation begins, because this is where meaning has not yet been assigned. The moment awareness speaks from this place, form follows. Modern language points to the same truth from another angle. Joe Dispenza describes how people remain addicted to their past emotional identity, even when that identity is painful. The familiar stress of struggle can feel safer than the unknown calm of freedom. When someone reaches zero, the old emotional loops tied to spending, earning, striving, and worrying are interrupted. This interruption can feel terrifying if one tries to cling to the old self. But if the interruption is allowed, it becomes liberation. The nervous system is no longer rehearsing yesterday's patterns. Space opens. This is why zero is dangerous and powerful at the same time. Left undefined, it becomes emptiness. Consciously assumed, it becomes infinite creative capacity. The same silence that can echo with fear can also amplify authority. The deciding factor is assumption. What you assume zero means will determine whether it collapses you inward or opens you outward. What follows is not a motivational fantasy and not a survival strategy. It is a precise explanation of why zero is neither lack nor abundance on its own, and why in 2026 it may be the most potent state a person can enter if they understand how to occupy it correctly. By the end of this, you will see that zero does not ask you to panic or to hustle. It asks you to choose. Zero is psychological before it's financial. There is a subtle but decisive shift that occurs the moment you stop treating zero as a quantity and begin to recognize it as a condition of consciousness. Numbers by themselves are inert. They do nothing. They command nothing. They only reflect the state of the one observing them. Yet most people unconsciously reverse this relationship, allowing the number to dictate the state rather than allowing the state to define the meaning of the number. This reversal is where fear is born. A blank canvas does not threaten the painter who understands creation. To one who knows how to work with form, the blankness is not an absence but an invitation. To another, it feels like failure because they are still comparing it to a finished work they believe they should already have. Zero functions in exactly the same way. To the mind still identified with outcome, reputation, and momentum, it feels like a ruined painting. To the mind anchored in authorship, it feels like a beginning untouched by mistakes. This is why the same number can produce panic in one person and clarity in another. The panic does not arise from zero itself, but from the meaning layered onto it by memory, comparison, and expectation. Someone who equates worth with accumulation experiences zero as a threat to identity. someone who understands consciousness as primary experiences, zero as neutrality. And neutrality, when understood, is not weakness, it is leverage. Neville Goddard was precise about this point. He taught that the meaning assigned to any condition determines the outcome that flows from it. Circumstances do not create states. States interpret circumstances. The moment a person assigns zero the meaning of lack, the nervous system responds with contraction, urgency, and fear. The moment zero is assigned the meaning of openness, reset, or authority, the body relaxes and the mind becomes receptive. Nothing external has changed. Everything internal has. This is why attempting to fix numbers without addressing state produces exhaustion rather than stability. The mind is still operating from reaction. It is still negotiating with fear. But when zero is approached as a psychological position rather than a financial emergency, the entire relationship to money begins to reorganize. There is no longer a need to rush, prove, or compensate. The individual is no longer chasing relief through accumulation. Relief is assumed first. Once this is seen clearly, a quiet realization follows. If zero is a state before it is a number, then it is not something that happens to you. It is something you occupy. And if it can be occupied unconsciously, it can also be occupied deliberately. Nothing left to defend, explain, or maintain. There is a quiet finality to reaching zero that most people misunderstand. It is not dramatic on the surface, yet internally it functions like a clean severing from a former version of the self. When the familiar structures fall away, the mind loses its usual reference points. The habits of maintaining appearances, defending choices, and explaining circumstances suddenly have nothing to attach to. What remains is not chaos, but exposure. And exposure, while uncomfortable, is honest. Identity is rarely built consciously. It is assembled gradually through repetition, reaction, and performance. Spending becomes a way to signal stability. Saving becomes a way to signal control. Earning becomes a way to signal worth. Over time, these behaviors harden into a sense of self that must constantly be upheld. Zero interrupts this entire process. It collapses the background noise. There is no longer anything to sustain the performance because the stage itself has been cleared. The effect is similar to closing every application running in the background of a system. At first, the sudden quiet can feel unsettling. The mind, accustomed to constant activity, interprets stillness as danger. But as the noise fades, something else becomes noticeable. Energy returns, attention sharpens. What once required effort to maintain no longer drains resources. The system is no longer compensating for inefficiencies created by an outdated identity. This is what Neville meant when he spoke of dying to the former man. He was not referring to loss, punishment, or regression. He was pointing to the necessity of ending identification with a self that no longer serves the desired state. As long as the old self is being protected, the new state cannot stabilize. Zero enforces this ending without negotiation. It removes the props that allowed the former identity to continue unconsciously. For many, this is where discomfort intensifies. Without the familiar markers of success or failure, the mind searches for something to cling to. It wants reassurance, explanation, or immediate replacement. But this moment is not meant to be filled yet. It is meant to be complete. The ending must be allowed to finish. Only then does the space become available for something new to take form. Neville Goddard emphasized that transformation is not additive. You do not become new by stacking better habits on top of an unchanged identity. You become new by allowing the old to dissolve. Zero accelerates this process by stripping away what was never essential. What remains is not a diminished self, but an unoccupied one. Yet there is a critical distinction here. An ending that is not followed by assumption becomes emptiness. A cleared system with no new directive idles indefinitely. This is why so many people stall at zero, mistaking the death of the old self for the completion of the process. The ending is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Without rebirth, zero remains unfinished. And this is precisely where the next shift must occur. There is a point where neutrality, if left unattended, begins to harden into stagnation. Zero, when misunderstood, becomes a place where movement stops rather than a place where direction is chosen. This is not because zero lacks power, but because power that is not directed remains dormant. The stillness that initially feels relieving can slowly become heavy when no new assumption is allowed to take its place. The mind often confuses the absence of negative thinking with the presence of creation. Dropping overt lack talk feels productive, but without a corresponding assumption of fullness, nothing actually shifts. Silence alone does not generate form, it simply waits. When zero is paired with fear, hesitation, or passive observation, it turns into a prolonged pause. The individual is no longer reacting, but they are not authoring either. Time passes, yet nothing reorganizes. This state is like standing in a vehicle with the engine running, but the transmission set to neutral. There is potential energy, but no engagement with direction. The system hums yet goes nowhere. From the outside, it can look like patience or restraint. Internally, it often feels like being suspended, unsure of what comes next. The danger is subtle because nothing appears wrong, yet nothing resolves. What keeps someone here is not a lack of knowledge, but a reluctance to assume. Assumption feels risky because it asks for commitment without evidence. The mind, trained to wait for confirmation, prefers to linger in neutrality rather than risk being wrong. But neutrality is not safety. It is delay, and delay, when prolonged, begins to feel like fate. Neville Goddard was direct about this. He taught that imagining without assuming produces no result. Awareness must move. It must occupy a state. Remaining undefined is not humility. It is indecision. Zero magnifies whatever accompanies it. When accompanied by fear or doubt, it magnifies emptiness. When accompanied by assumption, it magnifies creation. This is why some remain at zero far longer than necessary. They believe they are waiting for clarity, when in truth they are waiting for permission. But no permission arrives because the state has not been chosen. The moment awareness declines to define itself, reality reflects that hesitation with stillness. Nothing pushes forward because nothing has been installed. To turn zero into power, something must be placed within it. Not forcefully, not emotionally, but deliberately. The state must be named internally, even if nothing externally confirms it yet. Without this installation, zero remains an open loop. With it, zero becomes the most responsive position a person can occupy. Before money, there is being. When everything familiar has been stripped away, what remains is not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be recognized. Before money is counted, before plans are formed, before strategies are imagined, there is the simple fact of being aware. This awareness does not need validation. It does not need resources. It exists prior to outcome, and it is from this level that all outcomes emerge. Zero, when entered consciously, returns the individual to this foundational position. Most people are trained to believe that creation begins with tools, capital, or opportunity. In reality, these are secondary effects. They appear after a state has been assumed, not before. Awareness is the generator. Form is the echo. When this order is reversed, effort multiplies and results diminish. When the order is restored, movement becomes efficient and often effortless. Electricity exists before any appliance is plugged in. It does not depend on the device to validate its power. The device simply reveals what was already present. In the same way, zero reveals awareness without attachments. No object is currently demanding expression, which means awareness is unclaimed. It is not being pulled in multiple directions by obligation or reaction. It is free to author rather than respond. This is why zero can feel unsettling. The mind is accustomed to defining itself by what it manages, owns, or fixes. When those reference points dissolve, awareness appears naked. Yet this nakedness is not vulnerability. It is authorship. It is the position from which identity is chosen rather than inherited. Nothing external is dictating the next move because the source has returned to itself. Neville Goddard insisted that God creates from awareness, not from resources. He used the word God not to indicate a distant figure, but to point to the creative power of consciousness itself. When awareness knows itself as I am, without qualifiers, it is no longer negotiating with circumstance. It is speaking first. And whatever follows must conform to that declaration. Zero in this sense is not absence. It is preform. It is the moment before decision becomes visible. The danger is not in being here, but in misunderstanding what this position requires. Thought alone is insufficient. Intellectual agreement does nothing. Awareness must be felt as source, not analyzed as concept. The body must register the authority of being before the mind seeks expression. This is where the transition occurs. Zero is no longer something to endure. It becomes something to inhabit, not as a waiting room but as the origin point. From here, creation does not begin with effort. It begins with identity, and identity, once assumed, reorganizes everything that follows. Feeling supplied without evidence. There is a particular emotional tone that signals a state has been assumed, and it is not excitement, anticipation, or urgency. It is relief. Relief is the body's recognition that something is settled, even if the senses have not yet caught up. This is why assumption does not feel like trying. It feels like exhaling after a quiet decision has already been made. From zero, this tone is easier to access than at any other point because there is nothing actively contradicting it. Most people believe abundance should feel stimulating, energizing, or euphoric. In practice, those sensations belong to pursuit, not possession. When something is truly handled, the nervous system does not spike. It relaxes. This is why the calm felt after a bill is paid is so instructive. The relief appears before the receipt is examined, before the balance is confirmed. The feeling comes from the internal conclusion that the matter is resolved. That conclusion precedes evidence. Zero removes distractions that normally interfere with this feeling. When there are multiple numbers, obligations, and comparisons in play, the mind is constantly adjusting, recalculating, and reacting. From zero, the field is clean. There is no competing story demanding attention. This makes it the easiest place to assume fullness, because nothing else is insisting on lack. The absence of noise allows the assumption to register deeply. This does not require imagination strained into vivid scenes or emotional intensity forced into place. It requires alignment with the emotional signature of being supplied. The body recognizes this signature instinctively. Shoulders drop, breathing slows, thoughts stop racing ahead. There is a subtle sense of continuity, as if tomorrow is already handled. This is the feeling that precedes form. Neville Goddard emphasized that feeling is the secret, not as sentiment, but as conviction. Feeling, in his language, meant the acceptance of a state as real. When relief is present without evidence, the state has been entered. From that point, imagination is no longer creating in opposition to the world. It is creating in advance of it. Zero supports this process because it does not demand justification. There is nothing to prove, nothing to balance, nothing to defend. The assumption does not have to fight existing conditions for dominance. It simply occupies the space. And once occupied, it stabilizes through repetition, not effort. Each return to the feeling reinforces the identity of being supplied. What follows from this is subtle but decisive. When abundance is assumed from zero, behavior begins to reorganize without strain. Decisions feel quieter. Timing feels less urgent. Actions arise from coherence rather than desperation. The state holds not because of inspiration, but because it has become familiar. And familiarity, once established, is what allows a state to persist long enough to become visible. Nothing to chase, nothing to prove. When zero is entered as a state rather than endured as a circumstance, something unexpected happens to motivation. It begins to loosen its grip. The constant inner pressure to push, force, or chase starts to dissolve, not because desire has disappeared, but because identity has stabilized. Motivation is only necessary when the self is split, when one part is trying to drag another part toward a future it does not yet believe in. From zero, that split has already closed. Much of what people call motivation is actually anxiety in motion. It is the nervous system attempting to outrun uncertainty by staying busy. Goals are pursued not from clarity, but from discomfort, with stillness. Zero interrupts this pattern. With nothing external demanding performance, the system no longer needs adrenaline to function. Action, when it arises, is quieter and more precise, because it is no longer compensating for fear. This is why the analogy of autopilot is so accurate. Once a destination is set internally, the system no longer requires constant manual correction. The mind does not need to rehearse reasons, justify timing, or compare progress. The identity has already been assumed, and behavior naturally aligns with it. There is no chase because there is no doubt about direction. Movement becomes a byproduct, not a struggle. Zero removes comparison in a way few other states can. With no visible markers to measure against others, the habit of scanning for validation loses relevance. Urgency fades, not because time has stopped, but because identity is no longer contingent on speed. The individual is not reacting to external pressure. They are living from an internal reference point. This is the difference between effort driven by fear and action arising from coherence. Neville Goddard often pointed out that effort is a sign of resistance. When a state is truly occupied, behavior flows from it without strain. You do not need motivation to be who you already are. You do not need reminders to act in alignment with an identity you notice yourself living from. The need for motivation dissolves as certainty takes its place. What replaces motivation is system. A rhythm begins to form, subtle at first, but reliable. Decisions are made from a sense of inevitability rather than pressure. Rest no longer feels like avoidance. Action no longer feels like survival. Both become expressions of the same assumed state. Zero makes this possible because it removes the noise that normally disguises these signals. As this rhythm stabilizes, another realization follows. The most dependable way to maintain a state is not through daytime effort, but through the periods when conscious resistance is lowest. The state must be returned to when the mind is quiet, receptive, and unguarded. This is where identity is reinforced without argument, and this is why the next phase of the process does not occur through action, but through sleep. Sleep is where the ledger is written. There is a moment each day when the conscious mind loosens its grip and the deeper layers of identity become accessible without resistance. This moment is not dramatic. It arrives quietly as the body settles and the mind begins to drift. In this threshold state, awareness is no longer arguing with itself. It is receptive. What is impressed here does not feel like effort. It feels like acceptance. This is why sleep has always been the most reliable gate through which states are sealed. SATS, the state akin to sleep, functions like the final save before a system shuts down. Whatever is active at that moment carries forward. The mind does not analyze it. The body does not question it. The state is simply recorded. From zero, this process is unusually efficient because there are fewer competing impressions. The ledger is clean. What is written now stands out clearly, unobstructed by previous entries. This is why feeling provision and continuity before sleep is so powerful. It is not about visual detail or elaborate scenes. It is about implication, a brief moment of feeling that life is handled, that tomorrow is already supplied, that movement is assured without urgency. These impressions settle deeply because they are not competing with daytime vigilance. They are received as fact. Neville Goddard consistently emphasized that imaginal acts take root most effectively when the mind is relaxed and undistracted. In SATS, imagination does not need to persuade. It declares. And because resistance is minimal, the declaration is accepted without debate. This is how assumption becomes law. Not through repetition alone, but through timing. Detailed plans often fail here because they invite analysis. They activate the problem-solving mind, which immediately looks for confirmation or contradiction. Brief implication scenes bypass this entirely. A sense of continuity, a quiet relief, a feeling of having arrived. These impressions do not ask the mind to figure out how. They simply inform it that the matter is settled. Night after night, the same state impressed at this level begins to feel normal. Normality is powerful. What feels normal does not require attention. It does not trigger vigilance. It becomes the background assumption through which daily events are interpreted. From this point, reality does not need to be forced into alignment. It begins to rearrange on its own, responding mechanically to the state that has been consistently occupied. This is where zero stops being a pause and becomes a decree. The ledger is no longer blank. It has been written in the quiet, where doubt has no voice. And once written here, the world has no choice but to reflect it, because the state is no longer temporary. It has been installed at the level where identity is decided. Life organizes around the assumed center. Once a state has been assumed and stabilized, reality does not respond with emotion, encouragement, or resistance. It responds with structure. Events begin to arrange themselves around the center that awareness now occupies. This is not dramatic or symbolic, it is mechanical. Just as gravity does not choose which particles to gather, life does not evaluate the worthiness of the state you have assumed. It simply organizes around it. From zero, this organization is especially visible because there is little excess to obscure the pattern. When the assumed identity becomes the center, ideas begin to appear that feel natural rather than forced. Opportunities arise without urgency attached to them. Encounters occur that seem incidental but carry momentum. None of these feel like miracles. They feel obvious in retrospect, as though they could not have happened any other way. This is what Neville referred to as the bridge of incidents. Not a single event, but a sequence that only makes sense once it has unfolded. Each step appears ordinary on its own. Together they form a path that could not have been consciously planned. Zero functions as the launchpad for this process because it removes interference. There is no competing identity pulling events in conflicting directions. The assumed center is clear. The analogy of gravity forming planets from dust captures this perfectly. Dust does not struggle to become a planet. It responds to attraction. In the same way, money, ideas, and opportunities do not need to be chased once the state is assumed. They cluster, they align, they move toward coherence. The individual does not need to manage the process emotionally. The process is impersonal and precise. What often surprises people is how unemotional this phase feels. There is no constant reassurance, no dramatic confirmation. Things simply begin to work. Reality responds without commentary, reflecting the state as if it were the most natural arrangement possible. This is why effort feels unnecessary here. The state is doing the work, not the personality. As this unfolds, one final responsibility becomes clear. Zero magnifies whatever state is occupied. If the assumed center is stable, life organizes cleanly. If it is inconsistent, organization becomes fragmented. The launchpad does not choose the destination, it amplifies it, and this amplification is exact. By the time this stage is reached, zero is no longer experienced as absence. It is experienced as origin. Everything that appears from this point forward carries the signature of the state that was assumed when nothing else was in the way. And this is why zero, once understood, is not something to escape. It is something to respect. Zero is power. Use it carefully. When everything is stripped back far enough, what remains is not a problem waiting to be solved, but awareness waiting to be defined. Zero is often mistaken for absence, because the mind has been trained to measure value only by accumulation. Yet zero is not a verdict on your future or a summary of your past. It is definition-free awareness. It is the point at which meaning has not yet been assigned, and for that reason alone it carries unusual power. Nothing is fixed here, but everything is possible. This is why imagination is never neutral. Even in stillness, it is active. Even in silence, it is choosing. Zero does not pause creation. It intensifies it. With fewer distractions, fewer obligations, and fewer emotional habits pulling awareness backward, whatever state is quietly occupied gains strength quickly. Fear at zero does not stay small. Neither does certainty. The state you dwell in here does not fade into the background. It becomes the background. Neville Goddard consistently warned that imagination creates whether it is used consciously or not. Zero magnifies this truth. When there is no external momentum to lean on, inner momentum becomes decisive. Awareness, left unattended, defaults to habit. Awareness, assumed deliberately, becomes authority. The difference is not subtle, and the consequences are not delayed. Modern neuroscience arrives at the same insight through a different doorway. Joe Dispenza explains that when emotional attachment to a past identity dissolves, the body stops rehearsing familiar stress patterns. This interruption creates a window in which new patterns can organize without resistance. Zero often creates this window naturally. The old signals are quiet. The future is not yet loud. What fills the space is whatever you repeatedly return to. This is why the moments of quiet matter more than dramatic decisions, especially the moments before sleep, when the mind loosens and the body accepts what feels true without argument. In those moments, there is no need for numbers, projections, or reassurance. There is only the sense of being provided for, of continuity already unfolding, of life moving forward without strain. When that feeling becomes familiar, it does not remain internal, it becomes structural. From that point, Reality responds without emotion or commentary. Events align because the center has stabilized. Choices simplify because identity is no longer divided. What appears does so without urgency, because urgency was never the engine. Assumption was. This is the final truth. Zero is not something to fear or escape. It is something to respect. It will magnify whatever state you choose to occupy. And because everything begins there, the responsibility is simple and absolute. From zero, assume wisely.